Hi, I'm Lindsay Hall, Head of Thought Leadership at S&P Global Sustainable1.
And I'm Esther Wielden, a Senior Writer on the Sustainable1 Thought Leadership team.
Welcome to ESG Insider, an S&P Global podcast where Esther and I take you inside the environmental, social, and governance issues that are shaping the rapidly evolving sustainability landscape. It's June, and in my house, that means the end of the school year, the start of summer vacation, trips to the swimming pool and the beach. But June also brings the start of the Atlantic hurricane season, which runs through the end of November. And as we'll hear in today's episode, 2024 is expected to be an extremely active season.
We'll also hear today how climate change is leading to more intense storms over time. 2023 ranked fourth in terms of the most named storms in a year since 1950. And that included 7 hurricanes and 3 major hurricanes. That's according to the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Major hurricanes are defined as Category 3 and above. Hurricane intensity is labeled on a range from Category 1 on the lower end up to Category 5. For reference, many of our listeners may remember Hurricane Katrina, which we'll hear referenced in today's episode. That was a Category 5 before weakening to a Category 3 when it made landfall along the northern Gulf Coast of the U.S. in 2005. S&P Global Sustainable1 has a new seasonal hurricane forecasting model that projects an even more active hurricane season in 2024, with a best estimate of over 14 hurricanes and 8 major hurricanes. And as we'll hear from today's guest, this has big implications for many stakeholders, everyone from homeowners to financial institutions, insurers, as well as central banks.
To put some additional context around this, there have been 363 weather disasters that each caused $1 billion or more in damage from 1980 through August 2023, according to NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. And of all those billion-dollar-plus weather disasters, it was tropical cyclones or hurricanes that caused the most damage, more than $1.3 trillion in total, with an average cost of $22.8 billion per event. Hurricanes are also responsible for the highest number of deaths, nearly 7,000 since 1980, according to NOAA. To learn more about what's ahead for hurricanes, today we're talking with Tim Hall, a senior climate scientist at the Climate Center of Excellence here at S&P Global Sustainable1. He explains his forecast for the season ahead, how climate change is impacting longer-term trends in physical hazards like hurricanes, and how the science is evolving to help stakeholders make better-informed decisions to adapt and prepare for the effects of climate change. He starts off by describing his role and his background.
I'm primarily responsible for developing hazard models due to climate change and severe weather, and I've worked on many climate hazards in the past few years in this job, including tropical cyclones, which we're going to talk about today, but also coastal flood risk, river flooding, and wildfire, for example. Before I was at Sustainable1 in S&P, I worked for nearly 20 years as a staff scientist at a NASA research lab in the Columbia University campus, doing all sorts of areas of climate change research. Prior to that, my background is in physics.
Okay, great. We're having this conversation in early June, which, as I understand it, is also the start of hurricane season.
It sure is, at least in the North Atlantic, which is a very active region for tropical cyclones. And that's the generic terminology for what we call in the North Atlantic more familiarly hurricanes. In the Pacific, they're called typhoons, and other regions are called cyclones. And in the North Atlantic, traditionally the hurricane season starts in the beginning of June, as you mentioned, Lindsay, and it runs through November. I mean, that's a little bit of an ad hoc definition. We have certainly had hurricanes in the historical record before June 1st and actually after the end of November. But most hurricanes in the historical record occur in August and September, and a few in July and October. But the peak is in August and September. So right now we're sitting at the beginning of the season.
Okay. And as I understand it, you are projecting a high frequency of hurricanes and major hurricanes in 2024. Can you tell me more about what it is you're projecting, first off?
Absolutely. We're projecting with our projection model and a very active season that we're starting right now. We're not the only ones doing that. A number of the other well-known organizations that do what we call seasonal forecasting of hurricane season are also projecting very active seasons. And although the different models that are projecting active seasons have different ingredients, different methodologies, and different components that go into them, essentially there are 2 main ingredients that are primarily responsible for everyone saying the upcoming season is going to be extremely active, like possibly historically active. Think the 2005 season, the year of Katrina, seasons like that. And those ingredients are, one, that the ocean temperatures in the North Atlantic, which are kind of the fuel for strengthening hurricanes, are historically high right now, well above the average for this time of year. They were equally high last season also, but this season there's an additional component that last season was buffering us from the warmth of that ocean water. And this season that buffering is no longer there. And that component is El Nino, La Nina cycle. Some of the listeners may have heard of that, but it's a natural mode of climate variations that typically waxes and wanes on a 2 to 3 to 4 year cycle. It's not totally regular. It has to do with sloshing of seawater in the Pacific Ocean, but the Pacific is so big and absorbs so much energy from the sun that it has global ramifications. And it turns out that when you're in an El Nino state, like we were last year, it actually tends to suppress hurricanes in the Atlantic. And when you're in the opposite state called La Nina, it tends to enhance hurricanes in the Atlantic. And right now, we are leaving an El Nino state and entering a La Nina state. So those two ingredients, very warm seawaters in the Atlantic and also moving into a La Nina state, are a double whammy that are the reason why we are, and other organizations as well, forecasting an extremely active season. Both in terms of the total number of storms that form, the total number of storms that reach high intensity categories, say category 3 and higher, and potentially also landfall and impacts and damages and loss on various parts of the U.S. and North American coastline.
Okay, I have a couple follow-up questions. I think the first one I want to ask is about climate change. As you mentioned, there have been hurricanes forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Katrina was in 2005. How is climate change contributing to hurricane season?
That's a great question. And it's actually a kind of a distinct question from the forecast for this particular season. And it gets to the difference between long-term climate projections or forecasts, like we're looking 5, 10, 20, 30 years out and even further, to by comparison to just say 6 months out or next year or just next month. Those are very different beasts, really, and they require completely different tools to tackle. Different ingredients go into them. Different things are more important or less important. So for long-term climate change, there are many factors that are really robust in our projections: rising seawater, warming temperatures. Hurricanes are not in that category of most robust projections, their impacts on the changing climate. It turns out that when you look out in projections by the sort of climate forecast models that are based on the fundamental equations of physics and chemistry, you look to the end of the century, those models don't really do hurricanes very well. And they have very mixed signals when you look to the end of the century. But there are a few things in the long term that seem pretty robust, both in the models and from our analysis of what's happened so far. And that is that hurricanes are becoming more intense. They're getting stronger. The ones that form are getting stronger. That seems to be pretty robust. They're also raining more. So flooding in coastal regions due to rainfall is going to increase. What's less well known, but equally important, is how many will form. So you could have fewer hurricanes actually, but the ones that do form get more intense. And another really tough thing to project in the long term in a changing climate, next decade, for example, is the tracks that the hurricanes take. So they may form somewhere over the open ocean, but to do damage on coastlines for financial loss, for example, that hurricane actually has to get close to or make what we call landfall, interact with, populated centers on the coast. And if it doesn't do that, if it spins off and just dies in the open ocean, well, it's kind of interesting scientifically, but it may not be so relevant in terms of financial impacts. So all those ingredients are changing in a changing climate, but only some of them do we have a good handle on. So that's the long-term changing climate. And in our group, what we do is we build models based on the historical record and look for subtle patterns of changes in the historical record in terms of the climate change that's already happened. Then we use a few of the robust signals, like the changes in sea surface temperature from large-scale, long-term climate models to drive our kind of analysis of the historical record to make forecasts out to mid-century. We don't actually go beyond mid-century because the uncertainty increases exponentially. So that's the long-term picture. We see increased intensity We see some regions in the U.S. that will have enhanced hurricane activity, some regions actually with decreased activity because we see some changes in the way hurricanes propagate through the ocean. Now, the shorter term, that is a seasonal one, is a very different beast because there are ups and downs and natural cycles of climate that aren't really related to long-term climate change, and they impact hurricane activity also, but they don't last longer than 6 months or so or a year, like the El Nino, La Nina cycle I mentioned. So we're projecting a very active season next year, largely due to the natural variations in El Nino and La Nina. If we look out the next couple of decades, we're projecting some regions to have more activity, some regions to have less due to longer term climate change signals.
Okay, so I think I hear you saying that climate change is leading to, broadly speaking, intensifying of events like hurricanes.
Yes.
Talk to me about the financial impacts, which you briefly touched on. How do we estimate those?
Well, if you have some assets on the ground that have some financial value, many such assets are vulnerable to extreme winds. I mean, you think of a home, a roof can get ripped off, and in severe cases like Hurricane Michael landing in the Florida Panhandle in 2018, you can really just wipe out a lot of residential structures in the path of the hurricane. So, those structures, there's huge loss to populations. The people are now homeless, but there's also insurance loss because insurers are on the hook for some of that cost. And of course, airports and all sorts of physical assets on the ground are subject to extreme winds. So in a situation where, you're forecasting stronger hurricanes, the winds will be that much stronger. You'll have that much larger fractional damage on those exposed assets. In our group, we have done simulations of our synthetic storms, I call them. There are simulated hurricanes that would exist in climate of a certain state in the future. And we simulate hundreds of thousands of such storms. And then we compute the wind speeds from those storms on a grid in coastal regions. And then we can, given a portfolio of assets for that someone's interested in, we can look at the impact of those winds, given the nature of the asset, a residential home, a high rise, whatever. We can look at estimate the damage on those assets from those winds. And that's the basic name of the game for hurricane vulnerability and risk.
Okay, so this is really interesting because one thing we talk about a lot on this podcast is the need to break down silos between different groups in the sustainability world. So, for example, the importance of breaking down barriers between climate scientists like yourself and the business community and helping those two groups understand the priorities of each other. Can you take us behind the scenes a bit more? In your world, what conversations are you having and how is the science evolving?
It's changing rapidly. And I would say also the sophistication of the clients is changing, generally increasing rapidly, especially when we deal with large financial firms that have some of their own quantitative analysts on staff. Say reinsurance companies would be like that. Also, even some of the larger direct property insurers would be like that. And the technology of forecasting and both the hazard and the risk, the hazard being, the wind speed and the risk being the financial loss as a consequence of the wind speed, the technology to do that is also changing rapidly. Traditionally, there were natural catastrophe modeling firms whose primary clients were insurance companies, and they would estimate, in great granular detail, the damages from the upcoming hurricane season or next couple of years to a set of houses, for example, that were exposed to winds in, say, Florida or other regions that are vulnerable to hurricanes. And the insurance companies would use that to determine their premium pricing. And that was one group, but they didn't really think about climate change very much. And then there's another group of companies, like the company I came with when it was acquired by S&P, the Climate Service, TCS, who was looking more longer term, looking at climate change issues for not just hurricanes, but sea level rise, coastal flooding, wildfire, a whole sort of issues that are impacted by climate change next decade, the decade after that, the decade after that, long term. And these two approaches were somewhat separate, but they're not really separate. They shouldn't be separate. And so there's kind of, I think, kind of a natural consolidation emerging that's going on right now between those two types of approaches, the CAT modelers and the climate analytic companies, you might call them. And I like to call it, cat climate convergence. That's my own terminology for it. And so, the technologies that one type of approach has developed are now being applied in the other type and vice versa. So it's a very interesting time of rapid change in the field, both in the technology and what we can forecast and in what detail, and also the sophistication and expectations of the stakeholders.
Tell me more about that. What is the work that you are doing, and what changes are you developing?
What's currently on platform in our climanomics platform is actually not exactly wind speed from hurricanes, but rather the frequency of a hurricane passing nearby you, of an intense hurricane passing near you. But that's less directly connected to actual wind speed damage at an asset. So we were now switching. We have prototypes in place now. We've delivered proof of concepts where we're switching to our measure of the hazard actually being the wind speed on the ground, from a large set of statistically generated hurricanes that are consistent with the current and future climate. And that's an approach that's more in keeping with how cat modelers do things. But in our situation, we're doing it with climate change in mind. So what we generate from those wind speeds on the ground currently and in the 2030s and in the 2040s are not the same. They're evolving. They're evolving with complicated regional patterns due to our projections of the impact on climate change on hurricanes.
Okay. And when you're talking about these developments, who are these developments being used by?
Right now, that approach of wind speed on the ground, looking out several decades, though, is highly relevant to large financial institutions, banks that are responding to the Federal Reserve's request for climate stress tests of their portfolios. The Federal Reserve has cast its stress testing in a context that's more like cat modeling approaches. And looking at events of, say, a 100-year return period, a 1% chance per year, or a 200-year return period, wind speeds at a 0.5, 0.5% chance per year. That's the terminology we use. And so we've largely been responding to be able to help our clients more directly respond to those Federal Reserve stress tests.
Okay. And we're also seeing regulators, central banks in other parts of the world outside the U.S. increasingly using stress testing or asking for climate stress testing. Talk to me about your geographic focus.
It's global. All of our hazards are global. I started out talking about the U.S. because we've made a seasonal forecast for the North Atlantic, and the U.S. is exposed to North Atlantic hurricanes. But actually, our climate change hurricane hazard is global. We look at all the regions where there is a vulnerability to tropical cyclones, the generic term for hurricanes, like the Asia-Pacific sector is a very active region. Also, the Indian subcontinent and the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea, the South Pacific, think Australia exposed. All these regions are exposed to tropical cyclones. The physics is very similar across these basins, these ocean basins. The Federal Reserve is a U.S. institution, so naturally the banks we're dealing with they're mostly U.S. banks that hold U.S. assets, mortgage portfolios, and so there's some concentration on responding to the U.S. federal government's stress testing requirements. But actually, we're seeing similar related requirements in the Asia-Pacific sector. We've had banks in Singapore and Hong Kong ask about that. In the European sector, the EU is not directly exposed to tropical cyclones exactly, but there are plenty of other hazards. They are wind speed from other types of storms. And there's a whole taxonomy of hazards that are relevant to EU regulators, and many of which we already encompass. Others we encompass, but we're making it more directly relevant to their requests, and others that we don't yet encompass, we're rapidly working on to fill those gaps.
I think most people have an intrinsic understanding that hurricanes are a big deal. You read the headlines, you see the photos of the damage they cause on the news. But before talking to Tim, it was less clear to me how the business world thinks about hurricanes. So I found his explanation of how central banks and financial institutions are using this data to be helpful. I asked him to explain more about how climate hazards like hurricanes get translated into financial loss estimates that these stakeholders then can use.
So there's an intermediate step, what we call impact functions, what catastrophe modelers might typically call vulnerability functions or damage functions, where you relate the measure of the hazard, say wind speed, to a fractional loss on a structure. And we have a really dedicated team that's built thousands of such functions that depend on the hazard and the particular nature of the asset. And they are increasingly incorporating elements to acknowledge mitigation strategies or adaptation strategies for the assets, say flood defenses or building stronger, more wind resilient structures. So I think that's a place where resiliency planning can come into our analysis. It's that how do you get from the hazard, which I'm primarily generating, to a financial loss. That translation is the point where I think resiliency comes into the picture.
Okay, I think that's a really important step because often it's when you can put those dollar figures on things that people in the business community start to pay attention.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's much more valuable to stakeholders to have that estimated financial loss rather than just some kind of 0 to 100 metric or something, that's based just on the hazard. So we've taken that analysis to have that step to translate the hazard into dollar loss given an asset.
Okay. And then if I dig in a little bit more, when that step happens and it's translated, what's next? Like, how is that information used in your experience?
In probably a number of different ways. I mean, one would be to say, I mentioned earlier, the Federal Reserve stress test, to look at a large portfolio of, say, mortgages that a bank holds and see how exposed they are to a potential catastrophic loss. Another would be, insurers would say adjust their premiums. They can do that annually if regulations so permit, or they might instead decide to reweight their portfolios where they have policies and where they don't. I would hope that municipal planners could use such information as inputs to, new zoning rules, for example. I mean, those are all different aspects of application.
A lot of our audience, members of the business community, not necessarily focused in their roles on sustainability or climate, but if they're listening to this podcast, it's likely because they want to learn more about sustainability and climate issues.
Mm-hmm.
What's the sort of number one thing you think that business audience should understand about hurricane season?
Well, if you're in an exposed region, think Florida, the U.S. Southeast, the Gulf coasts, you are quite familiar with the damage that can be caused by hurricanes. Katrina, Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Harvey over Houston was a huge flooding event due to the rainfall from hurricanes. So I don't think anyone is going to sort of scratch their head and think, why should I be worried if there's a forecast for an extremely high season? You've seen the damages that can be caused. I mean, hurricanes cause wind damage. They cause flooding due to storm surge. They cause flooding due to intense rainfall. The damages can actually happen well inland, especially mostly from the rainfall effects. And so, anyone who's in that situation needs, to pay attention and be prepared for the potential for a couple of, severely damaging strikes this coming season.
Tim said there are adaptation and resilience measures that can help prepare for the impacts of increasingly severe hurricanes.
In terms of new building construction, there are ways to construct houses that are far more robust to intense hurricane wind speeds and are outside of active floodplains. So there is a kind of a natural feedback, I think, between changing hazard and risk and responses in communities to building codes. And that's happening to some extent kind of on an ad hoc basis because property insurers, some of your listeners may be familiar with this, it's been in the public news recently, property insurers are increasingly pulling out of hazardous regions they deem to be hazardous based on, the type of analysis we and other organizations do, because typically they don't have the flexibility due to local regulations to increase their premiums commensurate with the risk they see. At the same time, they get insurance from reinsurers, and the reinsurers aren't subject to the same regulations, so they are increasing the premiums. So the response is to just pull out of the market. That's happening increasingly, and increasingly homeowners are looking around for, insurance. They need insurance. They have mortgages. The banks require it. And if they can't get it from the private sector, where do they go? Well, the states are stepping in with kind of insurers of last resort. In Florida, it's called the Citizens Insurance Company. In Massachusetts, where I live, it's called the FAIR Plan. And in some cases, these insurers of last resort, public companies, are underfunded. The deductibles are high. The premiums are high. So it's not a good policy to have the private sector insurers pulling out of markets and turning to the state to bail you out. I mean, in my view, that's kind of a dynamic that's playing out right now in response to changing extreme weather hazard, not just hurricanes. It's happening in some sense because a coherent public strategy has yet to be put in place. So, the insurance companies in some sense are just responding to a kind of a policy vacuum.
So it sounds like a lot of big implications at sort of every step of the value chain, from the individual citizens and homeowners to the insurance companies and business community to the local governments.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Well, thank you, Tim. I've asked you a lot of questions today. What else? What else have we not covered?
I mean, I'm a scientist at heart. I'm a kind of climatologist, a meteorologist, a physicist by training. I tend to gravitate towards interesting issues of methodology. One of the things that's always fascinated me is if you look at the forecast skill we have as a function of sort of the lead time, like how far out you want to make that forecast, there's an interesting feature in that. And that is that if we're just talking a couple of days, then you're in the realm of weather forecasting. And we certainly have skill in weather forecasting. It's a couple of days, tomorrow, the day after that. If there's a hurricane in the Atlantic already, where is it going to be? And, in 3 days' time, well, it's making, a path towards Miami. We have information on that. People are used to that. And, they know that as time goes on, if they're talking 10 days out, well, they don't put a lot of weight on that forecast. And then for, if you look really far out, like decades out, next decade, the one after that, out to mid-century, that's the realm of climate change. And we actually have demonstrably good skill there. And the reason is that it's an entirely different beast that's causing those changes. It's external factors to the weather systems, like the composition of the atmosphere, more carbon dioxide, melting of ice sheets, higher sea level leads to more storm surge. And those are long-term things that are changing due largely to human inputs to the atmosphere. But there's an intermediate range, like months out to several years out, that's a little bit of it's kind of a minimum in our ability to do forecasts, because you're beyond the realm of doing weather forecasting, a couple of weeks, say, but you're well shy of the time scale where the climate change signal kind of pops through the noise. And you're in the realm of natural variability in the climate system, which is chaotic and difficult to forecast, comes to the fore and is important. So we're working hard on that to be able to fill that gap and do seasonal forecasting. We've made our seasonal forecast for the Atlantic hurricane season, but we're also in the background, we've got a research plan in place to develop seasonal and maybe year out forecasts for other hazards too, extreme temperature, wildfire seasons. They're kind of probabilistic forecasts. So what I mean by that is that there's a distribution of possible outcomes, but that distribution may shift up or down depending on our forecast of, the next season. But it's a challenging and difficult problem, but it actually sits at a timescale that is maybe a primary concern for a lot of businesses.
Well, I hope we can have you back on to talk about this more in future, because this is going to obviously continue to be a huge topic in the sustainability world, the hurricanes, but also all the other physical hazards that are changing due to climate change. So
I look forward to that. Thank you.
So Esther, today we heard a story about near-term and longer-term trends. Scientists are projecting that the hurricane season that just began will be extremely active, possibly historically active, Tim said. And over the longer term, climate change is contributing to more intense hurricanes, which means more of a threat in terms of financial damage and also in terms of loss of life. But as we also heard Tim say, the science is evolving rapidly to help us understand what's ahead. And so is the sophistication of stakeholders like financial institutions and central banks that use climate modeling to better understand what's on the horizon.
And this kind of information can equip stakeholders to make better decisions to adapt and prepare for the effects of climate change, whether we're talking hurricanes or other kinds of physical hazards. We'll include a link in our show notes if you'd like to learn more about the work that Tim and the climate scientists are doing at S&P Global Sustainable1.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of ESG Insider. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.
And a special thanks to our agency partner, the 199. See you next time.